Imagine a bank account. That bank account, it belongs to Africa. Get this, the money illegally flowing out of Africa nearly doubled from an already huge $50 billion a year in 2015 to a staggering $90 billion by 2020. That's about 3.7% of the continent's entire economic output just vanishing. This isn't some dusty old history lesson, it's an ongoing heist. But what if the owners of that account are finally changing the locks and starting to demand what's theirs? Today, we're not just looking back at a brutal history of grand theft. The story of colonial looting in Africa isn't a simple smash and grab. It was a calculated, long-term dismantling of local economies, replaced with systems purely designed for extraction. Before Europe's colonial scramble really kicked off, many African societies had their own booming trade networks and growing economies. But when colonial powers arrived, especially after the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference sliced up the continent like a cake, everything changed. The colonial economic model was brutally efficient at its main job, making maximum profit for the colonizing nation with minimal cost. How'd they pull it off? Through a few key moves. The 19th century brought two major economic shifts forced upon Africa. First, the mineral revolution, which kicked off with diamond discoveries in South Africa in 1867. Second, the cash crop revolution. This twisted West African economies away from diverse farming and local industries, pushing them to mass-produce things like cotton, cocoa, and coffee, all for European markets. Colonial policies often forced people to grow these cash crops, and prices were kept artificially low for European buyers and industries. Cotton, for example, became a textbook case of this forced specialization. While we often think of shiny minerals, cash crops actually made up about 63% of total exports from 38 African states by the time the colonial era ended. Take the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, and later the Belgian state. It was a horror show of exploitation. Huge amounts of resources like rubber, copper, and ivory were taken with chilling efficiency, often using forced labor and extreme violence. An estimated 10 million Congolese, about half the population at the time, died during this period. And here's the kicker, almost none of the wealth generated was put back into things like roads, schools, or healthcare for the local people. Any infrastructure built was mainly to get resources out faster. Similarly, in Nigeria, British colonial rule zeroed in on oil extraction, turning the nation into a major producer. Yet, most of that wealth never reached the majority. Even today, around 40% of Nigerians live below the poverty line, a harsh reminder of how these old colonial extractive systems keep on working. Local industries that might have competed with European factories. They were often deliberately shut down or stamped out. Unfair trade deals were shoved down Africa's throat, and financial systems were set up to suck profits out of Africa, and into European banks. This meant that, throughout the colonial period, far more wealth was flowing out of Africa than was staying in. The colonial state itself was basically a tool to control labor, money, and resources for Europe's benefit. This led to power being concentrated in the hands of a few, and a system of governance that wasn't democratic, didn't represent Africans, and certainly wasn't accountable to them. The brutal impact and lasting legacy just because the colonial flags came down didn't mean the economic drain stopped. Oh no. The systems for taking wealth were dug in deep, leaving a legacy that continues to cripple African economies today. And it's not just about the money that was lost, it's about lost opportunities for development, societies torn apart, and an ongoing fight for economic independence. One of the most glaring scars is extreme inequality. Countries like South Africa, Namibia, and Zambia have some of the highest income gaps on the planet. In South Africa, the racial wealth gap created by colonialism and apartheid is still incredibly stark. About half of all white adults own wealth of at least $250,000, that's around £11,000, but only 3% of black adults do. Wealth on the continent is incredibly concentrated. The Big Five markets, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco, are home to 56% of Africa's millionaires and over 90% of its billionaires. You can often see how this wealth buildup follows the old colonial pathways for money and infrastructure. Many African nations are still dangerously reliant on exporting just a few raw materials. Nigeria, for example, leans so heavily on oil that its economy gets slammed by shaky global prices, often pushing more people into poverty when those prices drop. This extractivist model, a direct leftover from colonialism, means that when global demand for basic commodities wobbles, African economies suffer way more than they should. The continent's share of world trade, which was already small, has actually shrunk recently because of these wild price swings. This dependence makes it hard to diversify their economies and build up local industries that could add value to these resources before they're shipped out. The infrastructure that was built during colonial times. It was mostly designed to get resources out of the continent, not to connect African markets or help them grow internally. This has left a massive shortage of essential infrastructure, things like good roads, reliable energy, and communication networks, which holds back industrialization and makes it harder for African countries to trade with each other. And it didn't stop there. Economic exploitation often meant that newly independent nations started offloaded with debt, creating cycles of dependency that are still around today. Unstable currencies have also eaten away at wealth. The South African rand, for instance, dropped 43% against the US dollar between 2013 and 2023. Currencies in Nigeria, Egypt, Angola, and Zambia fell by over 75% in the last decade alone, making many Africans poorer in US dollar terms, even if their assets grew locally. Beyond just the money, the looting hit cultural treasures hard. An estimated 90% of Africa's cultural and historical artifacts are held outside the continent, sitting in Western museums and private collections. That's an absolutely immeasurable loss of heritage, identity, and their own historical story. And the exploitation hasn't completely ended. Neocolonial structures are still in place, with foreign corporations and other interests continuing to pull wealth out, sometimes with the help of local elites, and often through shady deals that don't benefit the average person. Billions of dollars are still being siphoned off through things like companies misreporting import/export values to dodge taxes. In places like the DRC, the scramble for resources keeps fueling conflict and humanitarian disasters, with millions forced from their homes. Section 3, the plan to reclaim its billions, modern strategies for reclamation. Despite these huge challenges, a powerful wave of change is rolling across Africa. The story is shifting from one of victimhood to one of agency, as nations and their people are using smarter and smarter ways to reclaim their wealth and control their own destinies. This isn't just wishful thinking, it's a real, multi-part plan in action. A big and growing movement is the demand for reparations and the return of looted artifacts. The African Union has even declared 2025 the year of reparations, showing a united push from the continent. This isn't just about getting money, it's about acknowledging the historical wrongs, getting formal apologies, and truly fixing the system. We're seeing some real, though sometimes slow, progress in getting artifacts back. Countries like Germany and France have started returning important items to nations like Nigeria and Benin. Uganda recently got artifacts back from the University of Cambridge. While many of these returns are initially called loans, the pressure is building for them to be returned unconditionally, so Africa can reclaim its stolen heritage. Tackling crippling debt burdens is another key move. Calls for debt cancellation and restructuring are getting louder. Advocates rightly point out how these debts are often tied to historical exploitation or unfair lending deals. The UN Secretary-General himself has stressed the need to restructure debt systems that are suffocating developing economies. Boosting trade within Africa is a cornerstone of becoming economically self-reliant. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is a massive deal. It aims to create the world's largest free trade zone. This will break down those old colonial-era trade barriers that made it easier to trade with Europe than with neighboring African countries. The AfCFTA's guided trade initiative is growing, with 37 countries on board by late 2024, helping to get real, commercially significant trade flowing under new, better rules. Trade between African countries climbs to $192.2 billion in 2023, and fully implementing AfCFTA is expected to push this much higher. A major focus now is on economic diversification and adding value locally. Instead of just shipping out raw materials, the idea is to process them at home, turning cocoa beans into chocolate, crude oil into refined petroleum products, and raw minerals into manufactured goods. This creates jobs, transfers skills, and lets African countries keep a much bigger slice of the final value of their own resources. Stopping the massive outflow of money through fighting illicit financial flows, IFFs, is absolutely essential. Africa loses an estimated $90 billion every single year to things like tax evasion and multinational corporations playing games with trade pricing. The African Development Bank has rolled out action plans, and Pan-African conferences are being held to beef up systems for catching and stopping these outflows. The goal is to keep Africa's financial resources on the continent, working for its own development. Investing in its people is increasingly seen as Africa's most powerful way to reclaim its future. With the world's youngest and fastest growing workforce, putting serious money into education, skills training, and health is key to unleashing this potential. Initiatives like the United Bank for Africa committing $6 billion to empower small and medium-sized businesses under AfCFTA are directly aimed at developing this human capital. Governance and transparency reforms are also super important. This means strengthening institutions, fighting corruption, demanding transparency in contracts for resource extraction, and making sure national interests come first. Community-based natural resource management, CBNRM, programs are also giving local communities a real say in, and benefit from, the resources in their areas. Also, sustainable development initiatives, and countries taking control of their own resource sovereignty are gaining momentum. This means managing natural resources in an environmentally smart way that ensures long-term benefits for local people, rather than just short-term profits for outsiders. Technology, like Earth observation satellites and going digital, is helping with better resource monitoring and management. The journey to reclaim Africa's billions is a complicated one, and it's definitely not over. What other strategies do you think are vital for Africa to lock down its economic future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this exploration insightful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our future explorations of critical global issues. The story of Africa's wealth is a dramatic one, swinging from centuries of colonial theft to a determined, many-sided fight to get it back. The wounds from all those years of extraction run deep, showing up as persistent inequalities, shaky economies, and the heartbreaking loss of cultural heritage. Getting rid of colonial rule didn't automatically free African countries from exploitative systems. In many ways, they inherited setups designed to serve others. However, the narrative is definitely shifting. Across the continent, there's a rising tide of Africans taking charge. Through bold moves like the AFCFTA, passionate calls for reparations and the return of artifacts, strong strategies to fight illicit financial flows, and crucial investments in its own people, Africa is actively working to dismantle the remains of colonial economic control. The challenges are still immense, from global power imbalances to internal governance problems. Yet, the continent, with its rich natural resources and the world's largest free trade area, has what it takes to forge a new path for development. Projections actually show Africa as the second fastest growing region in the world in the coming years. The plan to reclaim Africa's billions isn't just about money. It's about justice, sovereignty, and the right of a continent to decide its own destiny and use its vast inheritance for the benefit of its own people. The fight is far from over, but the determination to build a future where Africa's wealth truly belongs to Africans is stronger than ever.